How did life originate? Is it possible to create life in a test tube? We will try to answer these and similar questions in today's episode of the series Secrets of Genes, in which I welcome you. My name is Edward Kejnowski, and I work as a geneticist at the Academy of Sciences of the Czech Republic. How did life originate? Just about 300 years ago, which is only about 15 generations back, people believed that life repeatedly arose from non-living matter wherever suitable conditions existed, and that complex organisms could emerge in this way. For example, insect larvae from decaying meat, earthworms from mud, or mice from dirt. And even thinkers like Isaac Newton and others found nothing strange about it. However, the idea of living beings arising from non-living matter, known as classical abiogenesis, troubled the Italian physician, naturalist, and poet Francesco Redi. In the 1660s, he conducted an interesting experiment. He covered the meat with muslin, a then new fabric recently brought to Europe from the Middle East, thus preventing flies from laying eggs in the meat. Then he observed whether he would find insect larvae in the meat. Indeed, no larvae appeared. In this way, he dealt a blow to the idea of the spontaneous generation of complex forms of life. The development continued, and the concept of classical abiogenesis found itself on increasingly thin ice. Gradually, more and more evidence accumulated that wherever an organism appeared, there had already been some kind of germ present from the beginning. Life arose only from pre-existing life. In other words, omne vivum ex ovo, literally life arises only from an egg. The idea of the spontaneous generation of living forms lingered for more than 100 years after Redi's experiment. It received its fatal blow only in 1858 through the experiments of the famous French biologist Louis Pasteur, who demonstrated that microorganisms, especially bacteria, are practically omnipresent. However, if you sterilize even the most nutrient-rich medium, for example by boiling it, no life will arise. Not even the simplest life in the form of bacteria. In the second half of the 19th century, the idea of the ubiquitous emergence of living organisms was abandoned. It was at this time that Darwin introduced the concept of the evolution of life on Earth. Even though he did not speak directly about the origins of life, according to him, there had to be a common ancestor of all living things. If, over the course of evolution, more complex organisms arose from simpler ones, it was quite logical to suggest that life could have once originated from non-living matter. This gave rise to the concept known as the theory of modern abiogenesis. Its proponents in the 1920s were the Russian biologist Alexander Ivanovich Oparin and the British scientist John Haldane. According to them, the simplest forms of life arose from a kind of primordial soup. First, basic organic compounds such as amino acids and sugars were formed from simple inorganic substances, and these then served as the building blocks of life. What were those inorganic substances from which life originated? What conditions prevailed on the ancient Earth? What was the nature of Earth's atmosphere at that time? From our perspective, those were truly hellish conditions that would certainly mean death for us. At that time, the atmosphere did not contain oxygen. Oxygen is actually the result of the activity of living organisms, especially green microorganisms called cyanobacteria. A similar oxygen-free atmosphere still exists on the other planets of our solar system. It is precisely an oxygen-free atmosphere that creates favorable conditions for the formation of organic compounds, including amino acids, from which proteins are made. Oxygen would actually oxidize and thus break down organic substances. Harold Urey based his assumptions on these premises and recommended to his student Stanley Miller to carry out the following experiment. In the laboratory, he was to simulate the conditions of the ancient Earth. In 1953, Miller took 2 flasks. Into one he put water, which was meant to represent the primordial ocean, and into the other he placed a mixture of gases, ammonia, methane, water vapor, and hydrogen, to mimic the original ancient atmosphere of the Earth. He then connected the flasks and inserted electrodes into the flask with the gases, whose sparking was meant to simulate lightning. He then heated the flask with water, which ensured circulation within the system. He thoroughly sealed the entire apparatus and sterilized it before the experiment to eliminate any ever-present bacteria that could otherwise distort his results. Instead, he let everything run. After a few days, the water turned yellow, becoming a kind of soup. And that was the moment Müller had been impatiently waiting for. After a week, he took samples and subjected them to analysis, at that time, paper chromatography, which was capable of detecting individual organic substances. The findings were shocking. From the original inorganic substances, a variety of organic compounds were formed, including sugars and amino acids. So, the hypothesis was confirmed. Both researchers believed that this might be how the simplest substances of life could have originated. So, they did not create life itself, but they produced its building blocks. Harold Urey reportedly even remarked at the time that if God didn't do it this way, he missed a good opportunity. However, from simple organic molecules to functional, self-replicating forms of life is still a long way to go. By the way, the year 1953 was a truly remarkable year. That was the year when, for the first time, a human stood atop the highest mountain in the world, as New Zealander Sir Edmund Percival Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing Norgay conquered Mount Everest. In the same year, James Watson and Francis Crick also deciphered the structure of the DNA molecule, the carrier of the code of life. And as we've seen, that same year also marked the opening of a new path in the search for the origins of life on Earth. Many successors followed in Miller's footsteps. They varied the conditions of the experiments in different ways, even though the basic setup remained similar. They added other gases, electrodes for example, or replaced them with a high-temperature furnace simulating the release of hot gases from the Earth's interior. In another version, ultraviolet radiation was used, which apparently played a significant role in ancient times. Let us remember that at that time the Earth was not protected by an oxygen atmosphere, and especially not by the ozone layer that forms from it and absorbs ultraviolet rays. Other scientists used high pressure to simulate shock waves that occurred during meteorite impacts or thunderstorms. Back then, everything about the origin of life seemed incredibly exciting and at the same time extremely simple. Almost as if all you had to do was mix everything in the right proportions, give it a good shake, boil it, and life would emerge. But it's not that simple. Over time, it became clear that we are still very far from solving the question of the origin of life. Much further than the pioneers of protobiology, this is the name of the science that studies the origins of life, ever thought. Today, for example, it turns out that the atmosphere was not completely devoid of oxygen and therefore was not as favorable for the synthesis of amino acids and the subsequent formation of proteins. It was either neutral or rather slightly oxidative. We now know that oxygen is not produced only by living organisms, but can also arise from the photolysis of water or even be released from certain rocks. All of this significantly undermines the interpretations we might make based on Müller's promising experiments. Does this mean we haven't gotten any closer to solving the mystery of the origin of life? So that's all for today. In the next episode, we'll talk about the hypothesis that life originated on the ocean floor around so-called black smokers. I'm looking forward to seeing you. And if you enjoy my storytelling, I'd really appreciate a like. And if you'd like me to continue making episodes about genetics and evolution, please subscribe. It helps these videos reach more people. I really appreciate your support. Thank you and bye-bye.